stop inserting politics in movies? You know, it's hard to watch a franchise like The Purge and not see its violence and demented characters as a criticism against the inequities baked into American society. These days, it can seem like we're unable to escape political messaging in movies at all. And watching someone preaching from a soapbox isn't always the most entertaining thing you can do with your evening. But what if I told you that movies, horror movies in particular, have always reflected social and political changes? These can be directed like in Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out, where we are reminded that modern social progress is always shadowed by the prejudice and antagonism of the past. Or not so direct, like in 2015's The Witch, inserting itself into the modern equal rights debate by presenting a centuries-old folktale which critiques the era's autocratic patriarchy and religious dogma. Now, not all horror movies tackle socio-political debates. You're not going to find deep cultural criticism in movies like Sharkbait 2022 or Troll 2 1992. But to understand what I mean when I say that horror movies are inherently socio-political, we'll first break down why exactly audiences are drawn to horror movies in the first place. Hey guys, it's Donna. So our collective love of horror movies have always fascinated me. Like, why do we choose to watch something knowing there's going to be gore, a terrifying jump scare, or the feeling of uneasiness after the movie when you get home and you're all alone? This all sounds terrible, yet we watch these movies over and over again. One of horror's most influential authors, Stephen King, may have an answer. In 1981, King published an essay in Playboy magazine titled Why We Crave Horror Movies, in which he seeks to pin down the human desire to be scared at the theater. He states, "Some of the reasons are simple and obvious, to show that we are not afraid. We also go to re-establish our feelings of essential normality. The horror movie is innately conservative, even reactionary, and we go to have fun." King posits how horror films appeal to humanity's worst instincts. We let our inner baddies out for some air, but in a healthy way that still follows social decorum. King claims that we watch horror movies to re-embrace the normality of our lives. Our experience with the slasher movie villain, or the house full of ghosts, is easier to stomach because our experience with these madmen and monsters is vicarious and brief. This remove allows us to process these events differently than if we were directly involved. Joe Dante, the director of many horror classics like Gremlins and The Howling, echoes this concept, stating, "The appeal of horror movies has always been about confronting death, and in their various ways, these movies help us cope with that. Now, death is the oldest and most constant fear we all share, the great equalizer. And while it may not be the first thing that comes to mind, our fascination with death and the darker demons of our nature is exactly why the most famous fairy tales appeal to so many people. Their protagonists are often subjected to traumatic experiences to provide audiences with guidance towards making the right choices." And just to add a little credibility to this notion, horror legend John Carpenter stated in the 2009 documentary Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue: The Evolution of the American Horror Film, "We imagine ourselves around the campfire, and the wise man, or whoever, is talking to us about the location of evil. And he says, evil is out there, in the dark. It's beyond the woods. It's the other tribe. It's the people who don't look like us, that don't speak like us, and that's the external evil. But it's harder to say that I have met the enemy, and he is us. We are the enemy." If we boil down our argument based on these insights, horror movies force us to confront our mortality through our greatest internal and external fears. And if we look back at horror movies throughout history, we can see how changes in society, culture, and politics directly influence the kinds of horror being produced. There are exceptions to this rule, but We could say that most horror films fall into two main socio-political categories: the outsider and the uncaring world. The outsider may be the earliest horror trope ever used, probably around that campfire that Carpenter spoke of. Whether the outsider is the problem, or our protagonist is an outsider inside a hostile environment, these unknown factors are the easiest fears to exploit. And what better example of the perennial outsider than in Mary Shelley's 1818 sci-fi classic, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. While seemingly countless adaptations exist, James Whale's 1931 version of Frankenstein remains the most iconic. Frankenstein cemented the story of a mad scientist, his hunchback assistant, and his reanimated monster as a cornerstone of American pop culture.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
However, the story we're given on screen bears little relation to the story penned by Shelley. While it was in part due to it being adapted from a stage play rather than the book itself, it was also due to the state of Hollywood in the 1930s. By this point, the reputation of Hollywood had reached an all-time low. Politicians and community leaders were clamoring to take control of an industry and product which they claimed had become publicly harmful. As a result, as Frankenstein was being re-released into theaters for another run, most of the Hollywood studios started officially enacting the motion picture production code. According to Fangoria writer, we could just put her name on screen, okay. A movie could not lower the morality of an audience and could not have any influence over women, children, the lower class, and those with a susceptible mind. It also stated that it was forbidden to ridicule the law or to portray any sympathy for lawbreakers. In other words, dissent and social criticism was nearly outlawed in American movies, while minority voices were actively suppressed. These general regulations were also paired with a comprehensive list of banned items. Hackett Cantabrana writes that these items include possible sexual relations outside of marriage, sexual perversion, which included the portrayal of homosexuality, sexual violence, graphic or realistic violence, and miscegenation, a term used to describe interracial relationships. These rules ultimately reflected the growing panic of the era. Labor and civil rights movements were really ramping up in many countries. Races and genders were intermingling like never before. Oh no! And new ideas about how to organize society were popping up everywhere. This, of course, stoked public fears that these movements were harbingers of communism and fascism, out to destroy traditional values. The Great Depression was still devastating the international economy, but prohibition was in its death throes. Moral crusaders had paved the way for a generation of organized crime. Family and friends questioned whether or not they really knew one another. Absolutely, everything seemed uncertain. So, in comes Frankenstein, to give us all a relatable outsider to fear, at the expense of the tragic story from which it's based. Now in the book, he sets out to torment his creator due to his abandonment and trauma. But in the film, he sort of bumbles from one scene to the next, accidentally committing atrocities like a roaming bear, until a lynch mob burns him alive, though this was obviously retconned for the sequel a few years later. Meanwhile, Frankenstein, whose name Henry in the movie, is never held accountable for creating this creature, or for the 3 murders at his hands. Not only that, a mere few weeks away from his laboratory is enough for him to swear off his life's scientific pursuits for that of a typical family man. He sheds his ego like a snake, shrugging off its skin. He never grapples with how all these murders are essentially his fault. He is quick to pass off all responsibility as soon as it suits him, and he's rendered blameless by every other character. He is our fickle, noodle-spined hero, folks. Not only that, but Frankenstein depicts the lynch mob as righteous avengers, and the seemingly mindless monster as the main villain, whose greatest crime was simply being created. It's easy to see how this take justifiably ruffled some feathers back in the day, while also placating the whims of the silent majority. The most important change is the brain. The movie explains that the monster's predilection for violence is not based on how others treated him, or how his maker abandoned him, but it is due to his brain originally being that of an abnormal criminal. This idea demands the audience to accept there is black and white separation between inherently good and bad people, which is exactly what movie studios following the production code wanted audiences to believe. However, even with these obvious changes from the source novel, and the added moralizations to placate the studio bosses and the masses, Frankenstein was still at the mercy of censorship. It not only required major re-edits in order to be shown in some states after the code was implemented, it was banned outright in a handful of countries due to its unsettling content and possibly blasphemous ideas, such as when Henry claims to know how it feels to be God. But with the monster dead and the newlywed Frankenstein enjoying their guilt-free life, the happy ending presents an ideal that the majority of American movies force-fed their audiences for decades. Zombies. Even if you've never watched anything horror, you know about zombies, and these things often became a metaphor for an uncaring world. Before the movie monster became the most overused trope in horror, and before they became the stumbling, flesh-eating nightmares that ate your favorite character on The Walking Dead, they were the mind-controlled slaves of a voodoo master. 100 years ago, a voodoo craze was sweeping the states, hitting newspapers, bookstore shelves, and live theater stages. It also swept a whole lot of misinformation about Haitian voodoo along with it, furthering negative African and African American stereotypes in multimedia. And in that sweep, an independent film made by two brothers brought the Haitian concept of zombies to the silver screen. White Zombie was shot mostly at night, on sets built for other movies. The plot surrounds a betrothed couple being hounded by a lustful plantation owner somewhere in Haiti. Beaumont, the owner, convinces the leering voodoo master, Murder, played by Bela Lugosi, to zombify the young woman so that he may keep her to himself. And what ensues? Wow.
Zombie! Allez, allez!
And these zombies were bug-eyed drones mindlessly working in Murder's factory and fields. And while these people are called the Walking Dead, they were very much alive. Murder's mind control magic isn't really explored, but the means by which he gathered his zombies is based on actual practices in Haiti, though of course, its representation is pretty bastardized. But that's unfortunately not out of the ordinary for movies in the early 1930s. Foreign cultures, and even native-grown subcultures, weren't strangers to habitual stereotyping. Like we've explored, the other is an easy target for fear and ridicule. In fact, this is a decade where you're going to see a lot of white saviors cutting paths through underdeveloped cultures. King Kong is probably the most obvious offender. But almost all of the early zombie films focused on black men terrorizing white women, even if a white person is the puppet master. Social inequities between different races were almost always trivialized or ignored on American screens at this point in time. But that didn't stop the movies from reflecting on the debate. The lack of minority roles and the constant recycling of racial stereotypes spoke more about the world outside of the movie theater than it did about the world depicted on screen. But that would change dramatically. Fast forwarding a few decades, a different team of indie filmmakers scraped together another cheap black and white horror film about zombies. And that was George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. In the 2010 documentary American Grindhouse, actor David Hess, who played the infamous Krug in Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, claims, "Growing up in the 60s, nothing was holy anymore. We were growing up as Americans, and I think probably were experiencing our own history for the first time. During this decade, we saw the deconstruction of the production code and the Hollywood blacklist. the surge of second-wave feminism, the rise of global counterculturalism, and the numerous hard-won successes of the civil rights movement. At the same time, we saw a succession of largely unpopular and costly wars. The never-ending buildup of the nuclear arms race, high-profile assassinations of politicians and civil rights leaders, and an entire new generation disconnected and disillusioned with their parents and country. No matter the social class or ethnic background, everyone's personal identity seemed to be in a flux. This all seemed to culminate in 1968. In 1968, the American horror film radically reinvented itself once again, this time as a grimmer, more nihilistic, and ultimately more socially and politically conscious entity. George Romero released Night of the Living Dead in the same year that the death toll in Vietnam was at its height and legendary civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. George Romero would recall in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. We were sort of pissed off that the 60s revolution didn't work. Peace and love didn't solve anything in the end. In fact, shit was looking worse. And I said, what would be a really earth-shattering thing that would be revolutionary and that people would refuse to ignore? The dead stop staying dead.
Oh, and there's one thing more. They like to eat living people.
Upon the release of Night of the Living Dead, its largely straightforward story of a house full of survivors struggling to outlast the zombie apocalypse almost instantly became the allegory of the 1960s. With everyone already feeling as if we were finally in the end of days, it managed to hit each of our fears, frustrations, and anxieties on the head, one after another. Shaun of the Dead star Simon Pegg claimed in the 2014 documentary Dock of the Dead. Zombies are very versatile as metaphors because they are us. They are the people among you, and I think maybe that preoccupation in society, the lack of safety that we're suddenly all feeling, zombies are a great way to cathartically act out that fear. It can be argued that Night of the Living Dead captured this most effectively in its pair of protagonists, Judith O'Dea's Barbara and Dwayne Jones's Ben. While their dynamic wasn't originally intended as a racial allegory, with Romero casting Jones simply because he was the best actor who tried out for the part, O'Dea stated in Dock of the Dead, "What's monumental to me about that film was the fact that in 1968, this film was released with a black man and a white woman. And throughout the entire movie, nobody made a big deal out of the fact that we had two different colors. It was pure survival." This would elevate Romero's pedigree to the godfather of zombies, and set the tone for the movie monster's usage up till the present day. Chicago Tribune film critic Scott Tobias wrote in 2007, "Starting with 1968's Night of the Living Dead, which has been read as a countercultural allegory for the country's racial and social ills, Romero's Dead series accommodated a new theme with each entry: mindless consumerism, the arrogance and folly of the Iraq War, the spinning of media lies. Zombies became a catch-all metaphor for conformity." Of course, this can seem sort of ironic considering how zombie movies are so often considered the most mindless form of horror entertainment today. The major successes of properties like Zombieland and The Walking Dead have thrust zombies more into the mainstream. But while those releases are renowned for good reason, their shambling fodder has largely lost their commentative natures. What we can pull from these two categories, the outsider and the uncaring world, is a constant push and pull of external and internal locations of fear. The individual factor we don't understand meets the dangers of mob mentality and mass hypocrisy. And external horror meets our internal struggles of self-identity, social acceptance, and morality. Probably one of the best and yet largely unsung examples of how the outsider and the uncaring world manage to work together as both a compelling horror experience and a socially aware critique is Wes Craven's 1988 film The Serpent and the Rainbow. Based on the non-fiction book of the same name by Wade Davis, the movie takes the constantly misunderstood topic of Haitian voodoo and treats it with the respect afforded any other religion, rather than a silly gimmick for uninformed audiences. As a result, it feels as if the movie actively attacks the stereotypes of white zombie and the social acuity of Night of the Living Dead. and manages to create a wholly unique experience between the two worlds. C.H. Newell, writing on his blog, Father Son Holy Gore, claims, "The entire use of the zombie here is as an allegory for control. Craven's movie explores the socio-political situation of Haiti in the mid to late 80s, where the government was working against the people, in turn forcing citizens to work against other citizens. This is where the zombies come in, symbolic of those used by the government, and an overall commentary on the state of existence living under an authoritarian dictatorship." Newell would go on to state that our protagonist, played by Bill Pullman, is also representational. He claims he's an outsider, an American at that, and intent on fixing the foreign place he's visiting. In reality, his visit causes more damage, including the deaths of certain people he meets, and this relates directly to US interference in Haiti. Sure, plenty of socially aware films aren't as in-your-face as The Serpent and The Rainbow or The Purge, but it's hard to deny that horror films continually reflect the eras in which they are produced. Along with The Witch and Get Out, there are so many examples of modern horror which have arguably blended these two main facets together, becoming snapshots of the social and cultural climate. We may not see the whole picture until, a considerable amount of time has passed, but regardless of what we determine to be the great horror stories of today, we'll continue to see these facets play out. This is because even though we've grown and evolved as a civilization, we still, deep down, are afraid of the exact same things. That's the end of the video. I'll see you guys next time. Stay psyched.